The richest parts of American history is black history, and yet today, so many of us know so little about it.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
We have so many cool stories of black and white serving together, fighting together in the Revolution, and yet what we hear today are the real victim stories, which are there. No question they're there, but that's only a part of American history.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
If you're going to talk about African-American heroes, by and large, you're going to have to talk about some Christians, and since we don't talk about Christians in textbooks, African-Americans really receive the brunt of that.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
America has a rich history full of heroes of all types, but the ones we hear the least about are African-American heroes. African-American heroes have been part of American history from the very beginning. Our tendency in textbooks today is when we tell about black history, we start in the 1960s and move forward.
Right.
And that's an important era of history. Dr. Martin Luther King and all the things that went with that, the March through Selma, the March on D.C., it's all important. But that's not where black history starts.
Right.
We have some real heroes of black history that we can take way back to the beginning. A great example is Richard Allen. Richard Allen is an African-American who became the founder of the first black denomination in America. His is a great story. He was raised as a slave in Delaware, living as a slave on a plantation in Delaware. And a Methodist evangelist came riding across that plantation preaching the gospel. Richard Allen hears the gospel, he gives his life to Christ, becomes not only a Christian, he becomes a zealous Christian. Richard Allen started sharing Christ with everything that moved on that plantation. And shortly the slave master became a Christian. The slave master says, "What am I doing owning slaves?" So Richard gets his freedom. Well, Richard wants to keep preaching the gospel. So he walks out of that plantation, walks out of Delaware, going north. He ends up in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia at that time was the nation's third largest city. There were 40,000 people in Philadelphia. You can imagine that being the nation's third largest city. Richard ends up preaching in a church in Philadelphia where he's preaching to 2,000 people a week. Now, that's a mega church today, but that's really a mega church. But, oh, and by the way, it was a white church that he was pastoring back then.
Wow.
Wait a minute, they didn't do that back then? Oh, yeah. There are so many examples of black and white together in early American history. There was definitely racial conflict as you go through parts of history, but there was so much cooperation that we never hear about. And so Richard Allen, great patriot that he is, actually becomes one of the soldiers in the American Revolution. So here's a pastor. He's a soldier in the American Revolution. He gets hooked up with signer of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. So here's an Anglo. Here's an African-American. They're working together. It's those two guys that formed the first black denomination in America. The AME denomination was founded by a black and a white working together. Then if you take that relationship, move forward a little bit, what you find is the period of what's called the Yellow Fever Epidemic. The Yellow Fever Epidemic of Philadelphia was 1793. It was terrible. No one knew what caused yellow fever back then. And so it terrorized everyone because they were losing about 120 people a day in the city to yellow fever. They were just dying off. 1/10 of the city died in that period of time. There were about 70 doctors in the city. They all left the city because they're scared to death. They're going to get yellow fever. They don't know what causes it. Well, Dr. Benjamin Rush was one of the very few who stayed in the city. He's called the father of American medicine. And the two guys that worked with him to treat yellow fever, the three of them that worked together to service that whole city, you had Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, but you had Richard Allen, and you had another black pastor, Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is the first black bishop in the Episcopal Church, and those three guys treated so much of Philadelphia. So there you've got this huge crisis going on, and what do you have? You have a white and two blacks working side by side to treat that epidemic. Great story of American history, great story of medicine, but we just don't hear it.
Although the history of black Americans begins in 1619 with the arrival of the first slaves in America, the political history of black Americans actually begins in the year 1787, the year in which the American political system was constructed. 1787 was the year the Constitution was written. Today, many critics assert that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and to prove this, they point to the 3/5 clause, claiming that the Constitution says that blacks are only 3/5 of a person. One of the earliest black Americans to investigate this claim was the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery and remained a slave until he escaped to New York. 3 years after his escape, he delivered an anti-slavery speech in Massachusetts. He was promptly hired to work for the state's anti-slavery society, and he also served as a preacher at Zion Methodist Church. During Douglass's first years in freedom in the North, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected that belief. However, Douglass later began to research the issue for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but rather it was an anti-slavery document. But if the Constitution is not pro-slavery, then what about the 3/5 clause? Had Douglass not read that clause? Yes, he had. He understood that the 3/5 clause dealt only with representation and not the worth of any person. You see, the Constitution had established that for every 30,000 inhabitants in a state, that state would receive one representative to Congress. The southern states saw this as an opportunity to strengthen slavery. Slaves accounted for much of the southern population. In fact, almost half the inhabitants of South Carolina were slaves. Therefore, slave owners could simply count their slaves as regular inhabitants, and by so doing could almost double the number of their pro-slavery representatives to Congress. Of course, the anti-slavery leaders from the North strenuously objected to this. After all, slave owners did not consider their slaves to be persons, but only property. These slave owners were therefore using their property, that is, their slaves, to increase the power of the slave states in Congress. The anti-slavery leaders fully wanted free blacks counted, but not slaves, if counting slaves would increase the power of slave owners. They understood that the fewer the pro-slavery representatives to Congress, the sooner slavery could be eradicated from the nation. Several other founders, including James Wilson and Elbridge Gerry, even used the slaveholders' own arguments against them. For example, Luther Martin proposed,
if slaves are considered property, then what renders this property different from any other type of property? That is, why should slaves as property be taken into account rather than horses, cattle, mules, or any other type of property?
These anti-slavery founders argued that if the South was going to count its property, that is, its slaves, in order to get more pro-slavery representation in Congress, then the North would count its property, that is, its houses, cows, and horses, to get more anti-slavery representation in Congress. Of course, the South objected just as strongly to this proposal as the North had objected to counting slaves. The final compromise was that only 60% of slaves, that is, 3/5 of slaves, would be counted to calculate the number of Southern representatives to Congress. In other words, it would take 50,000 slaves rather than just 30,000 before slave-holding states could get a representative in Congress, thus greatly reducing the number of representatives to Congress from states with extraordinarily large slave populations. This, then, is the 3/5 clause. It had nothing to do with the worth of any individual. In fact, free blacks in the North and the South often were extended the full rights of a citizen and regularly voted, both in the North and the South. The 3/5 clause had to do only with representation. This is why Frederick Douglass, unlike many today who have never taken time to study the Constitution, could emphatically declare that the Constitution, all of the Constitution, was anti-slavery.